The topic of sexual relationships between white slave mistresses and black male slaves during the slave era is a complex and deeply troubling aspect of history, marked by power imbalances, coercion, exploitation, and violence. These encounters are often shrouded in secrecy and taboo, making it difficult to fully understand the dynamics at play. However, historical accounts and records reveal a disturbing pattern of abuse and manipulation that underscores the dehumanizing nature of slavery. This article delves into the hidden, often horrifying aspects of these relationships, shedding light on the broader implications for both individuals and society. Slavery in America was a brutal system of forced labor that lasted for over 2 centuries, officially beginning in 1619 with the arrival of the first African slaves in Virginia. Enslaved Africans were considered property, deprived of basic human rights, and subjected to severe physical and psychological abuse. The institution of slavery was deeply entrenched in the economic, social, and political fabric of the southern United States, where it became a cornerstone of the agricultural economy. The plantation system created distinct gender roles for both enslaved individuals and their white owners. White men often held absolute power over the entire plantation, including the lives of both enslaved men and women. White women, although subjugated within a patriarchal society, wielded significant authority over the domestic sphere and, by extension, the enslaved individuals within their households. This authority often extended to sexual control and exploitation. The sexual relationships between white slave mistresses and black male slaves were inherently defined by a severe power imbalance. White women held the status of slave mistresses, while black men were considered property, lacking any legal or personal agency. This imbalance meant that consent was a complex, often impossible concept within these interactions. White women could exert their authority to coerce or manipulate black male slaves into sexual relationships. These encounters were not based on mutual attraction or affection, but rather on the mistress's ability to exploit their slaves' vulnerability and lack of power. The threat of punishment, violence, or reprisal hung over these encounters, ensuring compliance from the enslaved men. Sexual relations between white women and black men were heavily taboo in the antebellum South. While white men's sexual exploitation of black women was often overlooked or tacitly accepted, relationships between white women and black men were met with severe social condemnation and legal repercussions. This double standard was rooted in deeply entrenched racial and gender hierarchies. Because of these taboos, encounters between white mistresses and black slaves were typically shrouded in secrecy. White women risked social ostracism, scandal, and even violence if their relationships were discovered. For black men, the consequences were far graver, often resulting in brutal punishment or death. For enslaved black men, navigating the advances of white mistresses was a matter of survival. Refusing or resisting could lead to severe punishment, including whipping, mutilation, or lynching. Compliance, on the other hand, might offer some form of protection or favoritism, although it came at the cost of personal dignity and autonomy. Enslaved men were acutely aware of the precariousness of their situation. They lived in constant fear of their relationships being discovered, knowing that the repercussions would be swift and brutal. This fear shaped their interactions with their mistresses, creating an environment of perpetual anxiety and psychological trauma. The psychological impact of these encounters on enslaved men was profound. Being forced into sexual relationships under duress compounded the already immense suffering of slavery. These men were stripped of their agency and subjected to further dehumanization. The trauma of these experiences often left lasting scars, affecting their mental and emotional well-being. The motivations of white women who engaged in sexual relationships with black male slaves were complex and varied. Some sought to assert their dominance and control, viewing their slaves as extensions of their property. Others may have been driven by curiosity, loneliness, or dissatisfaction with their own marital relationships. While white women wielded significant power over their enslaved men, they were also operating within a patriarchal society that limited their autonomy. This dual position of power and subjugation contributed to the complexity of their motivations and actions. White women caught in sexual relationships with black men face severe social and legal consequences. Such relationships were viewed as a threat to the racial purity and social order of the South. Women discovered in these relationships could be subjected to public scandal, divorce, and loss of social standing. In some cases, white women accused of engaging in relationships with black men might face legal repercussions, including imprisonment or fines. However, the ultimate punishment often fell on the black men involved, who were subjected to brutal acts of violence and even lynching. While not a case of a white mistress and a black male slave, the relationship between Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman, and Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, highlights the complexities and power imbalances in such relationships. Hemings bore several children by Jefferson, underscoring the coercive nature of relationships within the context of slavery. The story of Celia, a slave in Missouri, offers another perspective on the sexual exploitation of enslaved individuals. Celia was repeatedly raped by her master, Robert Newsom, and eventually killed him in self-defense. Her subsequent trial and execution highlight the brutal realities faced by enslaved individuals and the lack of legal protection for them. The sexual exploitation of black male slaves by white mistresses underscores the broader racial and gender hierarchies that define the antebellum South. These relationships were a manifestation of the systemic oppression and dehumanization that characterized slavery, reinforcing the social order through sexual violence and control. The legacy of these encounters extends beyond the individuals involved, contributing to a broader history of racial trauma and violence. The exploitation and abuse of black men by white women left lasting scars on the African American community, influencing narratives of racial identity and resistance.